All right, and welcome back, man. I hope you guys didn't go too far. If you went for a drink of water or went to go take a piss, I'll understand. Anyway, yeah, man. So today's topic, we're going to talk about the pro sporting culture in Japan. As some of you may know, I'm a sports agent, football agent, registered here in Japan. But before becoming a professional football agent, I was actually a pro and semi-pro rugby player here in Japan. So I really got to witness, just the sporting culture from a different sporting code. And now that I've crossed over and I'm in another sporting code, there are certain similarities, but I'm just going to share, just things that I've noticed about just the professional atmosphere, the professional sporting industry within Japan. I'm not going to keep it only to rugby and soccer. We're going to include basketball, and we're just going to touch a little bit on baseball as well, because that's another sport. That's actually the biggest sport here in Japan. Number one is baseball, and then number two is soccer or football. And then number three, I would say, is basketball. And then number four is like usually the Japanese sports, like you'll get your either table tennis or judo and stuff. I'd say rugby, in terms of the most popular sports in Japan, I would say rugby is probably either number 5 or number 6. I definitely think the Rugby World Cup of 2019, which was hosted here in Japan, fucking epic event, man. I really do think it did a hell of a lot in really boosting, the sporting code's notoriety, within the country. And I really do think that a lot more people, have really taken a fancy to rugby. As a result, I remember the one time I was jogging, and I was jogging past the park that's usually by my apartment, and I noticed, kids that were mainly like soccer players. They were playing rugby. They didn't know what the fuck they were doing, but, it was just encouraging to see, them just, picking up the ball and running and trying to tackle each other. A lot of forward passes, but it's the interest that really struck me, It was the fact that it was just after the World Cup, and it was just, really encouraging to see just kids having a try at it, just really trying it out, basically. But in this lifetime, I don't think rugby is ever going to surpass basketball, baseball, and football. Those are like the top 3. All right. So yeah, man, just the first point I want to get into when referring to the pro sports industry in Japan is that it is in a very, very healthy financial situation. Teams in Japan generally, especially when they're trying to get like overseas talent, they pay top dollar. They offer big contracts to overseas talent, because the thing about Japanese teams is that if they're going to get an import player, you gotta be a guy who's already firing on all cylinders. They're one of those, it's one of those, how can I say, industries where they don't want to recruit a guy who's still developing. That's not their MO. Japanese teams, they want a guy who's established. Like, if you want to stand a good chance of playing high level in Japan, you must at least have been a professional sportsman in your country or wherever you're playing for at least 3 years or more. That's just how they feel. And I'll make reference, for example, in South Africa, rugby is arguably, probably the biggest sport in SA at the moment, because of the fact that the Springboks do so well. And because the Springboks do so well, that's created like sort of a demand for South African rugby players. Like, there are so many South African rugby players playing here in Japan, and it's because of the Springboks' dominance, And usually, obviously, their first choice would be to go for a guy who plays for South Africa and yada 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 and yada yada, and they usually offer them big contracts, close to $1 million just for one season. for a guy to just come over and play one season in Japan. And then obviously, if the guy's hasn't played for the Springboks, sorry, if the guy's only played like senior provincial, like for example, Super Rugby or Currie Cup level, then that dude would most probably, he'd get a lower tier contract, but it would still be worth a lot of money when you convert it into the South African rand, you know? So, yeah, man, they love experienced players, because how they see it is that when the guy comes over, he's going to serve as sort of like a mentor for the younger guys. So that's why Japanese clubs are willing to pay top dollar for the right, amount of players, or the right type of players, is so that they can come into, their organization and actually serve as like mentors, teach the younger guys coming through, the skills from a tier 1 nation, because South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, Wales, Ireland, England, France, those are pretty much considered like tier 1 countries. I think Japan is still tier 2-ish, but they're definitely fighting to be a tier 1, because, they were the first Asian team to reach a playoff stage during the Rugby World Cup. And respect to them, because, they went down to South Africa, in the playoff stages, which is ironic because at the 2015 World Cup, they fucked us up, man. They beat the Springboks. So that was a very big deal for them. It really was. As a result, they actually made a movie based on that experience, about beating South Africa at the World Cup. So that's how much it meant to them. And understandably so, man, because no one saw that shit coming. So thanks a lot, Heineken Meyer. Fucking hell. But anyway, I don't want to get into that. But yeah, I'm going to blame the coach who was in charge of the team at the time. All right. And then just looking at the next point when looking at the pro sports industry of Japan, the characteristics, of the sporting environment in Japan. Man, I'll tell you this from a personal experience. Moving over to Japan to play rugby and joining Line Rugby team, which is based in Chiba, Division 2 side. They play in the Japan East Division 2. Man, the first thing I noticed, man, about the players is they're hardworking. Very hardworking. But being from South Africa, we're no strangers to hard work ourselves when it comes to, putting in the work, at training and stuff like that. But I was just so amazed to see the repetition from the players. Like, before training started, like my first training session with Lion Rugby team. So I noticed, two scrum halves passing to each other. Just the repetition. I think they must have made something close to about 1,000 passes. This is before training started. They must have done at least about 1,000 passes. Maybe 500, from the left-hand side, and then another 500 from the right-hand side. Just punching, man. Just, getting in those reps. And that was really admirable to see. It was really good to see. It reminded me of back in the day during our academy days, because that's how we used to do it before training. And then obviously post-training as well. After the training session, same thing. A guy in your position will usually approach you and be like, listen, you want to practice? You want to do some extras? And I promise you, if you're a foreigner coming in to play in Japan, and if your teammate approaches you and says to you, listen, are you interested in doing some extras with me? You better fucking say yes. Because if you say no, I've got to go, blah, 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 I promise you, you're already creating a very negative, sort of like stigma to your name, because how they're going to view you is you're just a guy who's willing to do the minimal, work ethic that's required, but you're not about the grind. And I promise you, if you expose yourself in that way, you've pretty much, I don't want to say you've put a black mark, but you've lost a little bit of their respect, because Japan is very big on, like I say, work ethic. So if you're going to do the bare minimum and then want to fuck off, then it's really not going to do well for you, in terms of like, even with the team morale and just, their respect for you as the import player. You got to set an example, especially for the younger guys. Because now if you're going to be outworked by the younger player, what does that say about you? So man, I had to make sure that, I'm about the grind, that I stick around at least an hour or two after training, just doing extras, doing a bit of fitness, working on my strength and conditioning, that type of stuff. If you display that type of initiative and work rate, you'll do well playing in Japan. You'll do very well. And then in other sporting codes, so if you're playing either Major League or USL in the USA, if you're playing PSL level or NFD in South Africa, if you're playing obviously English Premier or probably First Division, Second Division, in the UK, and obviously in France as well, League One, League Two, in Spain, La Liga, and so forth. If you're basically playing League One or League Two in your country, then you stand half a chance of coming to Japan. Don't get it twisted. Japanese clubs have been known, especially like in the J1, they have been known to turn down some guys with high level experience in other countries. And they just say, nah. They don't believe that he can adapt to the Japanese way of life or the Japanese game plan, so to speak. So, and I always say this to guys that reach out to me that want me to represent them. And let's say the guys played like maybe League One in, I don't know, let's say, for example, this is just an example. Let's say in either Poland or in, I don't know, Iceland or, wherever, Denmark or whatever, there is still a chance that a J1 team won't be interested in them because maybe their perception is that the level that this person is playing is not as high as the J1. That's how confident the Japanese are when it comes to, their level of competitiveness within the J1. And rightly so, because Japan is actually pretty highly ranked in the world rankings. But we'll get to that in a moment. So, I definitely admire their, just their dedication and, just their will to always want to improve. And that's where the art of repetition comes in. Because, when you're repeating the same, type of practice or the same skill over and over again, it can get a bit monotonous. But for them, that's how you achieve greatness, is by repeating and doing the very thing that, maybe sometimes you just don't feel like doing, or maybe you find it too boring. For them, it's like, no, you got to do it. You got to go through that motion. You got to go through that motion over and over and over and master it. I've also seen this a lot of times every time I jog past like a junior high school or a high school, and I see the teams in like different sporting codes, like for example, let's say badminton or tennis. They literally practice their swings. They'll go like maybe 100 times just swinging in midair, just swinging their rackets in midair, just to practice that motion. So yeah, man, I admire it. And I actually do believe that's where the whole term of muscle memory comes in. Because when you teach your body a certain movement and you literally ingrain that movement as part of your daily movement, basically, then when it comes to game day, it's just going to become like involuntary because your body remembers how to move in that motion. So that's very interesting. But I don't want to go into the biomechanics of the body's movement, when it comes to sport. So we'll just keep it light. But I'm just explaining to you why the Japanese are so big into repetitive movements. is, I believe, it's due to the whole, muscle memory and the body remembering, that certain motion when it comes to having to perform on game day. All right, and then, just going back to their rugby, let's just look at how much Japanese rugby has improved. Now, if you go back, as back as 1995, I think in 1995, Japan was involved. I think they did travel down to South Africa and play in the Rugby World Cup. And I think they must have gotten hammered somewhere in the 100-0 in that World Cup. I think they did play against New Zealand in that World Cup. And I think they got hammered 100 and something. No. And they just kept coming back to World Cups. And I remember the other World Cup I watched them play in was the 2011 World Cup. Fast forward a couple of years later, where they played against the All Blacks again. And again, they got hammered. They got the beating of their lives, way into the hundreds. Again, I remember Tuiava, one of the star players for New Zealand, still one of my favorite players. He was on the wing that day, and he was just hammering them with tries, man. Sonny Bill Williams and all those guys, they were just having a field day, just scoring tries against the Japanese. And then fast forward, 2015, Japan, giant killers, slayed the Springboks. So the improvement has been there. And I think, what contributed to the improvement of the game is definitely the amount of foreigners that they've brought in to play, like in the top league. And I think what's also helped is Japan have this rule that there are only like a certain amount of foreigners allowed on the field at one time. And I think they implemented this rule to make sure that Japanese players get maximum amount of game time. Because it's really not going to help a nation if you're going to have this influx of foreigners and then you're going to have a star-studded foreigner team of guys who are just going to play, make tons of money and then go home. That doesn't help the local team. So I think that's why they've got this rule in place that there are only a certain amount of foreigners allowed on the field at one time, and then this guarantees that, their local players get the exposure and they get the opportunity to play, high tempo and high level rugby. It's really good. It's really, really good. And on the flip side, it's also good for foreigners as well, man, because that means that when foreigners come over to play, you don't have to worry about your body taking a beating weekend in, weekend out, because that's the one thing, man, about pro sports, whether it's rugby, whether it's football, whether it's basketball, is that sometimes as the import player, you're expected to play so much in other countries. So that wears your body down. Whereas in Japan, you get to play, but you also get ample rest as a foreigner. So in some games, you might come off the bench, not because you played badly the week before, but because of the whole foreigners on the field at one time policy. So guys are actually able to preserve their bodies. In retrospect, when you're a foreigner, you're actually getting paid to play. Not paid to play. You're actually getting paid to practice more than play. And obviously, what you bring off the field in terms of mentoring the younger guys and teaching them about being a professional, because usually the foreign imports are the guys who are fully professional, and then sometimes the local boys, the local Japanese guys, are usually guys who are semi-pro, so they will be the guys who work and play for the team. All right, and this usually happens because the teams especially within rugby, baseball, and basketball, the teams are usually owned by corporations. They're owned by companies. So what happens is when these teams get foreign players to come, they are actually employed by the company. So for example, I'll make an example. So let's start with rugby. So let's say a team like Toyota Verblitz or Ricoh Black Rhinos or Xerox, Canon Eagles. A team like Canon Eagles. So what happens is when they get a foreign player, the company, the corporation, Canon, offers, sort of like makes a job offer to that player to come over to Japan and play for the team. Same as in basketball. You get some teams that are also owned by corporations, that these teams, as a corporation, will send a job offer to the player for the player to come over. So in basketball, it's half. You get some teams that are just their own private organizations, and then you get some teams that are owned by corporations. Same as in baseball. I think it's also half. But I think in baseball, it's also more corporations, because you've got the Fukuoka SoftBank Hawks, you've got the Hanshin Tigers from Osaka, which are owned by Castle, and then you get other teams that are, Tokyo Giants, for example. They are privately owned, like they're a private organization. It's just Tokyo Giants. So within baseball and within basketball, it's half. But within the rugby, it's 100% company owned. All the teams that play professional and semi-pro rugby are owned by the corporations. And this was the corporation's way of their corporate social responsibility. So it was actually smart by them in doing this. It was really smart, because it is a great way for the corporation to give back to society, and you're doing it through sport. Now for the local guys, it's an amazing opportunity, because it guarantees them, job security, and the guys, even after they finish playing for the team that's owned by the corporation, they can work for the company until they retire, until their heart's content. So that's pretty much the culture that is within pro sports in Japan, is that there's a lot of corporate involvement and influence, because most of the teams are owned by corporations. In football, it's totally different, as the majority of the teams are privately owned. They are their own private organizations. For example, 2 weeks ago, I traveled to Shimizu in Shizuoka on my annual team visits, and I visited Shimizu S-Pulse. Man, they are such an amazing organization, such a well-run and organized professional football team. And they are their own private organization. They're not owned by a corporation at all. And all of the other teams I've visited as well: FC Tokyo, Yokohama F Marinos, Yokohama FC as well. Well, they've been relegated to J2 now. All of those teams are all privately owned, and majority of the teams in the J1, J2, and J3. So in football, it's a totally different ownership, as opposed to professional rugby and professional baseball and professional basketball, where there's a lot of team involvement. A lot of corporation involvement. All right. So yeah, I just thought I'd share that point about just the pro sports sporting culture over here. The one thing that I actually think is an advantage of corporations owning teams is the fact that it gives the teams a lot more financial muscle. And as a result, that's why teams are able to sign such lucrative deals to marquee players overseas. That's why they're able to offer massive contracts to overseas talent coming through, is because they have the financial backing of the corporation. And most of the corporations here in Japan, dude, I swear to you, I kid you not, most of these corporations are at least 90 to 100 years over. I mean, imagine it's, companies like, Toshiba, it's companies like Panasonic, it's well established brands that have been around for centuries on end. So that's why I think it's such a good thing, and it's such, how can I say, a brilliant strategy that most of the professional sports teams in certain sporting codes here are owned by corporations that have existed for centuries. It really helps the team in when it comes to branding. It means that people that are brand loyal to, your companies like your Panasonics or your Toyotas, it means that they're going to follow the team so much easier because the team is associated with this brand. Genius. Absolute genius, man. I fucks with it. I really think it's a brilliant strategy. And it's a strategy I'd like to see in more in more countries, because again, like I said, you often hear of teams going, bankrupt and being in large amounts of debt. Now imagine if they've got part ownership, or they are partly owned by a corporation. It would really get a lot of teams out of hot water when it comes to being in debt. And with reference to corporations, let's look at now professional football. Let's look at a company like Rakuten, which sponsors Vissel Kobe. Now, Rakuten, they were responsible for being able to get a high-profile name to come and play in Japan, such as Andres Iniesta. Because, let's be realistic, I think if Iniesta, if Rakuten was not involved, a Japanese team would have really had to, they would have really had to dig deep in their pockets to afford such a big name, such as Andre Iniesta. The guy makes $30 million per season. That's how much his contract is worth with Vissel Kobe. All thanks to Rakuten. And Rakuten doesn't even own Vissel Kobe. They're just like one of the main sponsors. So those are the things. And Rakuten wasn't only able to get Iniesta. At some point, they had Iniesta, David Villa, and Fernando Torres as well, all playing for Vissel Kobe. Where do you think that the money came from to do that? Because all three names are fucking expensive players. So Rakuten had to intervene. Otherwise, Vissel Kobe would have never been able to strike a deal and be able to afford all three players on max contracts like that. They would have never been able to. So this is where having corporation backing, has such an advantage. So man, it's really exciting, and it's really such a different way of running the pro sports industry, and it's just been amazing to witness. It's really been amazing to witness, and like I said, it's made me not be so surprised as to why the pro sporting culture is in such a healthy state here in Japan. It's definitely because of the corporation involvement. So man. So I just thought, for this episode we'd dive in and just talk a little bit about the pro sporting culture, because Japan is one of those countries that is just very closed off to the world. Like, a lot of people know a country such as Japan exists, but they don't really know, the pro sporting environments, the corporate environment. They know nothing about Japan, because Japan is one of those countries that doesn't really go out of their way to market themselves to the rest of the world. It's really one of those places whereby you got to come over here and witness it for yourself. I remember for myself as well, when I was still in France and I got the opportunity and the offer to come and play here in Japan, I had no fucking clue what to expect, And the person who was responsible for organizing my contract to Japan, the one thing he said to me, because I had a little bit of, not necessarily arrogance, but I had the cockiness of saying, yeah, man, I'm sure I know how Japan's going to be. I played in Hong Kong, so I'm pretty certain, like just quickly. And the one thing that person said was, listen, Japan is nothing like Hong Kong. And when he said that had me a little shook, because it literally meant that, I was literally in the dark, man. I didn't know what to expect. That scared me, but it excited me at the same time, because I was like, listen, whatever is thrown my way, I'm sure I'll be able to handle it, and I'm just going to enjoy the experience. And as a result, I did, man. I spent 2 amazing seasons with Lion Corporation, and I enjoyed the last 2 years of my rugby career. It really meant a lot, because like I say, a lot of the values that the Japanese players were displaying was pretty much how I played my rugby my whole career. Just the work ethic, putting in the time, putting in the effort, the repetitions, the hard work while no one is watching. I'm the type of guy, man, that when putting in the hard work, I don't like to document it. I don't have time to be Facebooking it or Instagramming it to show you how hard I work. For me, it's a habit I developed since I was in high school, that I'll let the results speak for themselves. So if I'm playing well, then you better know that I put in the work. And that's the same thing I witnessed with the players over here. They weren't interested about documenting it, Instagram videoing it. No. Everybody's phone was in the bag, and everybody was just out on the field putting in the hard yards. That's the respect I gained for Japanese athletes, because I just felt I had a similar value to them. And I'm one of those people, if I identify a characteristic in you that I know I have within myself, you've immediately got my respect. So yeah, I just thought, on this episode we talk about the environment that is within the Japanese sporting industry. And yeah, man, every single individual that I've ever met or that I've ever come into contact with, whether they were from South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, USA, when they come in and play in Japan, they always say they're having the time of their lives. They're enjoying the experience. So yeah, I hope if you're a rugby player or soccer player, basketball player or baseball player, and you've got dreams about coming to, ply your trade here in Japan, I'd say definitely do it. For football players, keep reaching out to me, man. I love that on LinkedIn every day, man. I'm constantly connecting with pro football players inquiring about Japan, and I love that. I really love that. I think more Japanese teams in all sporting codes are being very open to having, foreign imports come in and basically bring another dimension to the game in whichever sporting code. So it's a beautiful thing, man, and it just makes me appreciate sport that much more, because it reinforces why I love working in this industry. All right, so thanks for listening, guys. Thanks for stopping by, man. I really appreciate it. Just before I go, yeah, man, just keep supporting the podcast. I really appreciate you guys. You can support the podcast. You can donate to the podcast. You can go on the Limitless Athlete membership site. I'll put the link on the description. You can also get the Sports Biz podcast merch. I'll also make sure to put the link on the description as well. Follow us on social media at m.a.g _ agency group on Instagram. The link will also be in the description. So I just want to connect with you guys, man. Connect with me. Let me know what you think about the podcast. And if you got any, queries or inquiries about the pro sporting culture in Japan, hit me up. I'd love to hear you guys' questions or thoughts, you know. So thank you once again for stopping by. And this is Sports Biz from an agent's perspective. Take care. Bye.